The 8th of October, 1931. A Thursday afternoon in Lower Manhattan. In a room at 33 Liberty Street, the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York takes a vote. Outside that room, American banks are closing at a rate of roughly 17 a day. It is a technical vote on a technical instrument, the discount rate, the price at which the Reserve Bank lends cash to the commercial banks that come to its window. They raise it from 1.5% to 2.5%. 7 days later, they meet again and raise it to 3.5%, effective the 16th. 200 basis points in 8 days. Writing 30 years afterwards, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz called it the sharpest rise within so brief a period in the whole history of the system, before or since. Now hold that and set it beside what else you would have seen in the United States in October 1931 if you had stood anywhere outside a bank. That month, 522 American banks closed their doors. Not merged, not rescued, suspended payment with the deposits inside them. $471 million of ordinary people's money frozen in 31 days. Take September and October together, and the number is 827 banks in 61 days. So the institution, created 18 years earlier for the express purpose of stopping bank panics, responded to the worst banking panic the country had ever seen by making cash more expensive. That is not an accident. It is a defense. Something was under attack, and the Federal Reserve was defending it with everything it had. It was not the banks. In the 6 weeks ending on the 28th of October 1931, the gold stock of the United States fell by $727 million, 15% of the entire national reserve, gone in a month and a half. Roughly 3/5 of it went to France. The Federal Reserve was not asleep in the autumn of 1931. It was awake, it was decisive, and it was working for the gold. So here is the question this video exists to answer. How does a country end up with a monetary system that treats a fixed price for metal as an emergency, and 9,000 failed banks as weather? Because that is the real story of the Great Depression in America, and it is not the one you were taught. Let me be precise about the claim, because this is a subject where precision is the whole game. Nobody in Washington ever voted to sacrifice the banking system. There is no meeting where that was decided, no memorandum, no cabal. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something, and by the end of this video you will know exactly why they are wrong. What there was, instead, was a rule. A rule that ranked one obligation above every other obligation, that had been written into law in 1913 by people who never imagined the two could conflict, and that defined in advance what counted as an emergency and what counted as bad luck. Defending the dollar's convertibility into gold was an emergency. 2,293 banks failing in a single year was bad luck. That is what a monetary constitution is for. It settles the hardest question in the system before anyone knows what the question will be, and by 1931 the answer had been sitting in the statute for 18 years, waiting. And the proof is not a theory. It is a calendar. Watch what happens to American banking in the weeks after the United States finally lets go of gold. So the trap was not sprung in October 1931. It was built in 1913 by people who were trying to prevent exactly this, and I want to show you the two lines of the law that did it. The Federal Reserve System was created by an act signed on the 23rd of December 1913. There is a video on this channel about the panic that produced it. 1907, J.P. Morgan, a locked library, and the short version is this. America had spent 77 years refusing to have a central bank, and in 1907 it discovered what the alternative looked like. One elderly private citizen deciding in his own house which institutions would survive until Monday. So the country built an institution to do that job by law instead. 12 regional reserve banks, a board in Washington, and a mandate to furnish an elastic currency, cash that could expand when the public suddenly wanted it. And in the very same act, a second obligation. The dollar was redeemable in gold at $20.67 an ounce. Every Federal Reserve note had to be backed by gold equal to at least 40% of its value, with the remaining 60% covered by what the law called eligible paper. Two mandates in one statute. Protect the banks, protect the parity. In 1913, in a growing economy with the world's largest gold hoard, nobody in the room thought those two sentences could ever point in opposite directions. Now look at that phrase, eligible paper, because it is one of the two hidden trapdoors in the system. Eligible paper meant short-term commercial bills, loans backed by goods actually moving through the economy, a shipment of cotton, an invoice, a harvest in transit. The idea, called the real bills doctrine, was that if the central bank only ever lent against real commerce, the money supply would automatically match the needs of trade. It sounds prudent. It is, in a depression, close to suicidal, because when trade collapses, eligible paper disappears. The one asset the Federal Reserve was designed to lend against evaporates at exactly the moment the banks need it most. The second trapdoor was the banking system itself. In 1930, the United States had around 24,000 commercial banks. Just over 8,000 belonged to the Federal Reserve System. Nearly 16,000 did not. Most were tiny, most were confined by law to a single location. No branches, no diversification. And if the local crop failed or the local factory closed, so did the bank. There was one more thing, and it was a man. Benjamin Strong had run the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since 1914. He was the closest thing the system had to a head, and he understood that its formal structure, 12 semi-independent banks, each able to refuse, worked only if someone was strong enough to make them move together. He died on the 16th of October 1928, aged 55. Be careful here, because there is a legend attached to this. Friedman and Schwartz argued that if Strong had lived there would have been no great contraction, and serious historians have been attacking that claim ever since. The safer statement is this: his death removed the one man whose authority could settle a fight, not the one man who knew the answer. And within months, the fight began, between Washington and New York, over the stock market boom, and it did something that should already sound familiar. Between January and July 1928, the Federal Reserve raised the New York discount rate from 3.5% to 5%, and sold government securities heavily. In August 1929, it went to 6%. Its stated reason was speculation on Wall Street, but there was a second reason, and it is in the record. Gold was flowing out towards France, and higher American rates would hold it. That is the first time the machine faced the question: cheap money for the domestic economy, or a defended parity? It chose the parity in 1928 before anyone had heard of a Great Depression. And then, in October 1929, the market crashed. I want to deal with the crash quickly, because almost everything popularly believed about it is decoration. Start with the image everybody has: ruined brokers jumping from Wall Street windows. It did not happen. The chief medical examiner of New York, Charles Norris, went public with the figures at the time: 44 suicides in Manhattan in the 4 weeks after the crash, against 53 in the same weeks of 1928. Fewer New Yorkers killed themselves that October than the October before. The dying came later, it came slowly, and it happened in bank lobbies. Now the more important correction. The crash did not cause the depression in any direct mechanical sense, and the evidence is the calendar. For 13 months after October 1929, American bank suspensions ran at between 59 and 90 a month, completely normal for the 1920s, a decade in which small banks failed constantly. Then, in November 1930, the number jumps to 256. In December, 352, taking some $370 million of deposits down with them. 13 months of silence, then the floor gives way. Whatever the crash did, it worked slowly, through falling prices and falling incomes, and the thing that turned a bad recession into a catastrophe arrived a year later, and it arrived through the banks. It started in Tennessee with the collapse of an investment house called Caldwell and Company, which brought down a chain of correspondent banks across the South. But the failure everybody remembers happened in New York, and its name is the reason. On the 10th of December 1930, a small tradesman walked into a branch of the Bank of United States on Southern Boulevard in the Bronx, wanting to sell his shares in the bank. He was advised to hold on to them. He left and told the street that the bank had refused to buy back his stock. By mid-afternoon, there were 20,000 to 25,000 people outside. Mounted police were sent in. The next day, December 11th, the New York State Superintendent of Banks, Joseph Broderick, closed it. The Bank of United States had more than 400,000 depositors, roughly $250 million in accounts. It was the largest commercial bank failure in American history to that point. And this is the critical detail that changes everything. Despite its name, the Bank of United States was an ordinary private bank with no connection whatsoever to the American government. A great many of its depositors were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who had understood the name to mean the state stood behind it. It did not. Nobody did. Broderick spent that night trying to make the New York clearinghouse banks put together a rescue. They refused. As he later testified, he warned them they were making the most colossal mistake in the banking history of New York. The New York Fed had spent days trying to broker a merger, and when that failed, it did not lend to keep the bank open, and the reason is doctrine, not malice. Under the real Bill's view, a bank that failed was a bank that had made bad loans, and its failure was the system cleaning itself. Liquidation was not a tragedy, it was hygiene. You will have heard the most famous expression of that view. In his memoirs, published more than 20 years later, Herbert Hoover described the liquidationists in his own administration, led by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, and put a line in Mellon's mouth: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate. The farmers liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. Treat that as what it is. Hoover says Mellon said it. Mellon never said it in public. He was long dead when the book appeared, and Hoover had an obvious interest in painting himself as the interventionist in the room. But the doctrine was real, even if the quotation is doubtful, and it was mainstream. The thing being described, that the collapse was a purge the economy needed, was believed by serious people in serious positions, and it explains why nobody reached for the fire hose in December 1930. And here's where the story stops being American, because the next blow came from Vienna. On the 11th of May 1931, the Kreditanstalt, the largest bank in Austria, holder of a huge share of the country's industrial credit, announced that it had lost most of its capital. An international rescue was assembled, and it failed. France blocked it because Austria and Germany had been negotiating a customs union that Paris regarded as a violation of the Versailles settlement. The economists Barry Eichengreen and Peter Temin describe what followed with a phrase worth keeping. In the petri dish that was the gold standard mentality, what started as a threat to one bank was allowed to mutate into a threat to the international financial system and the world economy. From Vienna, it went to Berlin. On the 13th of July 1931, the Donat Bank closed its doors. German banks shut for 2 days, and within weeks, Germany had imposed exchange controls and frozen its short-term foreign credits in what became the Standstill Agreement. That freeze matters to this story for a very concrete reason. American banks held German paper. Overnight, assets they had counted as liquid became assets they could not touch. Hoover had already seen the shape of it. On June 20th, 1931, he proposed a 1-year moratorium on all intergovernmental debts, German reparations and Allied war debts alike, and by the 6th of July, the 15 nations concerned had accepted. It bought weeks, and then came September 21st, 1931. On that day, Britain suspended the convertibility of the pound into gold. You need to feel what that meant, because it is the hinge of the entire story. The Bank of England was the institution that had invented the gold standard as a way of life. Britain had returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war parity, at enormous cost to its own economy, precisely to prove that the promise was unbreakable. And then it broke it. In an afternoon. If you were a French or Dutch or Swiss central banker holding dollars in New York, the 21st of September taught you one thing. The promise can be broken by anyone without warning. The rational response was to stop holding paper claims and start taking metal immediately before everyone else did. The day after, Hoover told the country that the course resolved upon by the British government created some temporary dislocations in the international world. In the 40 days that followed, 522 American banks would shut their doors. So now put yourself at 33 Liberty Street in the first week of October 1931 and understand that the men in that room were not confused about what they were doing. They were not ignoring the banks. The banks were simply not the emergency. The emergency was in the vault under the building, and it was leaving. The mechanics of defending a gold parity were completely standard, taught in every central bank in the world. Gold is leaving because foreigners prefer metal to your currency. Raise interest rates. Higher rates make your currency more attractive to hold and pull capital back in. It works. That is the point. It is the textbook, and the men applying it had been trained on it since the 19th century. But look at what a rate rise does to a domestic bank in October 1931. That bank is watching its own depositors queue at the counter. Its assets are illiquid loans it cannot sell without crystallizing losses. Its one source of emergency cash is the discount window of its reserve bank. And in 8 days, the price of that cash more than doubles. The economist Alan Meltzer put the failure exactly. The classic rule for a central bank in a panic, from Walter Bagehot, has 2 halves. Lend freely against good security, and do it at a penalty rate. In October 1931, the Federal Reserve remembered the penalty rate. It forgot to lend freely. The result is in the Federal Reserve's own published tables, and it is not ambiguous. 522 suspensions in October, $471 million of deposits frozen, the worst month in the country's history until March 1933. A suspension table is a very quiet document. On the ground that October, it was a notice pasted to a glass door, a queue that had formed before the bank opened, and a cashier saying the sentence that ends a bank. Not today. Across the whole of 1931, 2,293 banks, and 1 in 69 hundredths of $1 billion of deposits locked up. And the gold outflow stopped. That is the thing. The defense worked. Eichengreen and Temin summarize it in one sentence that could be the title of this video. When there was a threat to the United States' commitment to gold in October 1931, it responded by raising interest rates and driving the country deeper into depression. The gold stayed. The banks did not. Now I owe you the strongest objection to what I have just said, because there is one, and it is worth 30 seconds. The economist Scott Sumner has pointed out that the stock market barely reacted badly to those rate rises, shares barely moved after the first, and actually rose after the second. His reading is that contemporaries saw the defense of the dollar as stabilizing, not destructive. That is a real finding, and I am not going to hide it. But notice what it does and does not touch. It tells you what investors thought about the dollar. It does not change what a double discount rate does to a country bank in Iowa with a queue outside, and it does not change the 522. You can believe that the men in that room acted reasonably by the standards of their training and still see plainly what they prioritized when the two obligations finally collided. And here's where the story becomes genuinely damning, because in 1932 the Federal Reserve proved, with its own words, in its own archives, that it had never been as trapped as the legend says. Start with what was actually in the vaults. In December 1929, the United States held nearly 38% of all the monetary gold in the world's central banks. The Federal Reserve's own gold cover was above 55% against a legal requirement of 40%. By June 1932, in the depths of the collapse, the reserve ratio of the New York Fed was 50%. Chicago's was 75%. Then there is the admission, and it is remarkable. On the 8th of January 1932, with more than 2,000 American banks dead in the previous 12 months, George Harrison, the governor of the New York Fed, stood up in front of the New York State Bankers Association and told them that the reserve banks were in a position, on the basis of their present gold supply, to expand Federal Reserve credit to their member banks by some $3.5 billion. $3.5 billion, said out loud, to a room full of bankers, in the middle of the catastrophe. There was one genuine technical obstacle, and it deserves to be named honestly. Because eligible commercial paper had almost vanished, the Fed was having to pledge gold as collateral for the 60% of its notes that were supposed to be backed by paper. Gold that was legally surplus became operationally locked. The problem had a name, free gold, and it was real. And then Congress simply abolished it. The Glass-Steagall Act of the 27th of February 1932, not the famous one of 1933, a different law with the same two names, allowed government securities to serve as collateral for Federal Reserve notes. The technical constraint was legislated out of existence in February 1932. So what did the Federal Reserve do next? For one season, the right thing. On the 24th and 25th of February, the Open Market Committee authorized $250 million of purchases. On the 12th of April, $500 million more, at a rate as rapid as may be practicable. Over 20 weeks, it bought a little over $1 billion of government securities, more than doubling its entire portfolio. Prices steadied. The contraction slowed. And then, in the summer of 1932, it stopped. By the 14th of July, purchases were capped at $15 million a week. By the statement week ending the 30th of July, its purchases were effectively zero. Here is the part that should make you sit up. It did not stop because of gold. The economists Chiang Tai-si and Christina Romer went looking for the fear that supposedly ended the program and could not find it. No expectation of devaluation in the forward exchange markets. No unusual spread against the countries still on gold. No alarm in the Federal Reserve's own internal records. The American and British financial press treated the buying as a relief. What actually stopped it is in Harrison's notes from July 5, 1932. Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston were reluctant to continue. His words, "If the other large Federal Reserve banks are unwilling to proceed with the program, we cannot carry the burden for the entire system." 9 days later, Owen Young, the deputy chairman of the New York Fed's own board, put the structural problem in a single sentence. You may have 2 or 3 banks dictating the policy of the system at a critical time, just because of their ability to block a system program. And one more detail, small and devastating. During that entire expansionary program, 10 of the 12 reserve banks never lowered their discount rate at all. Only New York and Chicago did. There is a final piece, and it dismantles the last excuse. The Great Gold Drain of 1932 is usually described as the market punishing the Fed for printing money. It was mostly nothing of the kind. The Bank of France was repatriating its dollar balances because a French monetary law of 1928 obliged it to liquidate its foreign assets. Governor Moret told Harrison so directly in March 1932. New York had known since January, and in April, Harrison wrote back that they had felt for some time that it would be desirable rather than hurtful from the point of view of their position to have the Bank of France gradually repatriate its dollar balances. The Fed wanted that gold to leave. It was tidier that way. So by the autumn of 1932, the record shows an institution that had the reserves had been told by its own governor that it had them, had the legal obstacle removed by Congress, ran the correct policy for 20 weeks, and abandoned it because 3. Regional banks would not continue. That is not a golden fetter. That is a committee. And while it argued, the country went into its last winter. In June 1932, the panic hit Chicago. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation lent $90 million to the Central Republic Bank, the old bank of Charles Dawes, who had resigned as the RFC's president 3 weeks earlier, and it wound up its business 4 months later anyway. And from August 1932, the RFC had to name every bank it rescued, with Congress forcing out the earlier list, too, in January 1933. The intention was accountability. The effect was that any bank known to have been rescued became a target, and being helped became a death sentence. Which brings us to Dearborn, Michigan, on February 13, 1933. Detroit's banking system was about to fail. The Union Guardian Trust, part of a group on whose board sat Edsel Ford, needed the RFC's help, and the rescue plan turned on one thing. The Ford Motor Company had to subordinate $7.5 million of its deposits, agreeing to be paid last. Hoover sent 2 men to ask him, Roy Chapin, the Secretary of Commerce, and Arthur Ballantyne, the Under-Secretary of the Treasury. What they reported is preserved in the recollections of the acting comptroller of the currency, Gloyd Awalt, and it is one of the strangest conversations in American financial history. Ford refused. He would not subordinate a single dime, he said, because the principle was wrong, and he added a threat. On Tuesday morning, he would withdraw $25 million from the First National Bank of Detroit. Ballantyne explained what was at stake, close to 1 million depositors in Michigan, the support, by their estimate, of as many as 3 million people. Ford's reply, as they reported it, was that people might simply have to go through the experience of a crash, that the general effect would be that everybody would have to get to work a little sooner, and that might be a very good thing. In any event, he said, it had to come. Told his own company might be destroyed, he answered that he would build another one. He still felt young. And when he said that the trust company was dead anyhow, Chapin gave him the line that ought to be carved over the door of every central bank, that the corpse might communicate disease over a very extensive area. At about 1 a.m. on February 14th, the governor of Michigan, William Comstock, declared a state bank holiday. 8 days extended to March 6th. Nearly 1 million people were cut off from their money. A Walt's dry note on the outcome. Needless to say, Mr. Ford was unable to withdraw the funds. From Michigan, it spread state by state. Indiana on February 23rd, Maryland on the 25th, Arkansas on the 27th, Ohio on the 28th. By the 3rd of March, more than 20 states had closed their banks or rationed withdrawals. By the 4th, 37. And through all of it, the United States had 2 presidents and no government. Roosevelt had won in November 1932. Under the rules then in force, he would not be inaugurated until March 4, 1933, 4 months of interregnum in the worst financial emergency in the country's history. On the 18th of February, Hoover wrote him a letter and had it hand-delivered by the Secret Service. It said the major difficulty was the state of the public mind. It said hoarding had risen to a new high level and the bank structure was weakened, as witnessed Detroit. And it asked for something specific, prompt assurance that there would be no tampering or inflation of the currency, and that the budget would be unquestionably balanced even if further taxation were necessary. Read that again, because it is the whole video in one paragraph. In the middle of a national bank run, the outgoing president's proposed remedy was a public promise not to touch the gold value of the dollar. No reply reached Hoover for 11 days, and when it came, it committed to nothing. He is reported to have called the letter cheeky in private. He had his reasons. He was not going to inherit Hoover's policy by endorsing it, and he had already begun to consider doing exactly the thing Hoover was demanding he rule out. But the silence had a price, and the price was paid in metal. In February and early March, roughly $1.8 billion in currency, and gold was pulled out of American banks, almost 2/3 of it in the single week ending March 3rd. On that day, the acting comptroller of the currency wrote a line worth quoting exactly. March 3rd, 1933 might well be called the day of the big gold rush. The New York Fed lost more than $200 million of gold in a single day, and $150 million in currency. It ended the day roughly $250 million short of its required reserves. Chicago refused to lend it more, out of concern for its own ratio. Because on March 1st, for the first time, the reserve ratio of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had fallen below the legal minimum of 40%. The rule had finally bound. After 3 years of deflation, 9,000 bank suspensions, and 25% unemployment, the gold cover requirement had at last become a genuine arithmetical obstacle. So on March 3rd, 1933, the Federal Reserve Board suspended it. Just like that. An administrative decision, taken in an afternoon, exercising a power that had been sitting in the statute the entire time. Hold that next to everything that came before it, and the shape of this story is complete, which tells you what the gold cover requirement had been for the previous 3 years. Not a wall, but a doctrine. The last night of the old American banking system was the night of the 3rd to March 4th, and it is a farce. Hoover would not sign an emergency proclamation without Roosevelt's agreement. Roosevelt would not accept authority before he had it at noon. A letter from the Federal Reserve Board begging Hoover to act was delivered at 2 in the morning. Nothing was signed. So the officials improvised a plan B. If Washington could not close the banks, the states would. Eugene Meyer's people spent the night on the telephone waking governors. Illinois would not move until New York moved. Herbert Lehman of New York initially declined, on the grounds that nobody with authority had actually asked him. Clyde Herring of Iowa agreed at once. And Gifford Pinchot, the governor of Pennsylvania, was in Washington for the inauguration and could not be woken. He answered neither his telephone nor his door. They finally sent a fire engine to the house, and it roused him. He agreed at about 5 in the morning. That is how the American banking system ended, not with a proclamation from the White House, with a fire engine idling outside a governor's door in the dark. On the 4th of March 1933, the 12 Federal Reserve banks did not open. The New York Stock Exchange closed. Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in and told the country that the money changers had fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. They had not fled, they had shut. Now watch what happens when the rule goes. On the 6th of March, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday. On the 9th, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act in a single day. Its first title gave the president sweeping power over gold movements and foreign exchange. Its fourth allowed reserve banks to issue notes against any sound asset a commercial bank held. Taken together, those two provisions took the United States and its currency off the gold standard, in fact, weeks before anybody said so in public. The banks reopened in stages, the Reserve Bank cities on March 13th, some 250, clearinghouse towns on the 14th, the rest of the country on the 15th. On that 15th of March, the Dow Jones average rose more than 15% in a single session, the largest one-day percentage gain in the history of the index, a record it still holds. And the bank failures simply stopped. In the whole of 1934, the first full calendar year without the rule, 57 banks suspended payment in the entire United States. 57 against 2,293 in 1931. The thing that had been killing American banks for 3 years was gone, and what had gone was the rule. The rest, the call-in of private gold in April 1933, the revaluation to $35 an ounce, the $2.8 billion profit the Treasury booked on metal it had just bought at the old price, is the subject of another video on this channel, and it is the sequel to this one. Now, you could say America simply got lucky in the spring of 1933 that the recovery was coming anyway, and that the timing is a coincidence. So test it. 24 other countries ran the same experiment at different dates, and their results line up in order. Britain and Scandinavia left gold in September 1931, Canada in October, Japan in December, the United States in March 1933, Belgium in 1935. France, the Netherlands, and Poland held out until October 1936. Ben Bernanke and Harold James, studying 24 countries, found that between 1932 and 1935, industrial production in the countries that had left gold grew about 7 percentage points a year faster than in the countries that stayed. Broadly, the earlier a country left, the earlier it recovered. Not in every case, but as a pattern across 24 countries, it is about as clean as economic history gets. For the United States, the turn is visible in one line of data. Industrial production falls through 1930, 1931, and 1932. And in 1933, the year of the exit, it turns sharply upward and keeps going. Now, I want to be careful here because this is precisely the point where this story is usually stolen and turned into something false. There is a large industry built on the claim that the Federal Reserve was created in order to cause this, that a secret meeting on a Georgia island in 1910 designed a machine to crash the economy and confiscate the nation's gold. Some of the most popular versions of that argument rest on very old and very ugly tropes about who supposedly runs the world's money, and I want no part of it. It is also straightforwardly false. The plan drafted at Jekyll Island was rejected by Congress. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was a different law, publicly debated. And the chronology destroys the confiscation theory on its own. The deflation and the 9,000 failures came first, over 3 years, and the gold measures of 1933 and 1934 were reflationary. They raised the price of gold and pushed prices up. That is the opposite of a deliberate squeeze. There is a second thing I'm not going to do, and it is harder. The historians this video rests on do not agree with each other, and I am not going to pretend they do. Friedman and Schwartz, the most influential account ever written of this period, do not say the Federal Reserve chose gold over the banks. They say it failed. through incompetence, through a leadership vacuum, and through a bad theory of what money is for. Ineptitude, not intent. Eichen Green and Temin say something different. They say the regime itself did the work, that the gold standard defined what was thinkable, and that inside that mentality, large-scale rescue was not so much rejected as never seriously entertained. And Shie and Romer, whose evidence I have leaned on hardest, are explicit that proving the constraint was slack in 1932 does not prove it was slack in 1930 and 1931. On whether the Fed even had enough free gold to expand before February 1932, they write, Friedman and Schwartz and Chandler say yes, and Eichen Green disagrees. The question is open. So let me state the honest version of this video's claim, the one I will defend against anybody. No American official ever weighed the banking system against the gold parity and chose the gold. What happened is worse, and duller, and much more common. The system had been built so that defending the parity was automatic, urgent, and unarguable, while rescuing the banks was discretionary, controversial, and required 12 institutions to agree. So one happened, and the other did not. And when the rule that supposedly forced their hand finally became binding in March 1933, they suspended it in an afternoon, because it had always been theirs to suspend. The villain here is not Hoover, who worked harder on this crisis than his reputation allows. It is not Harrison or Meyer or even Mellon. It is a mechanism, and I can put it in one sentence. A rule designed to take a decision out of human hands does not abolish the decision. It makes it in advance, in ignorance of the emergency, and then punishes anyone who says out loud that it is still a decision. That is what this story is really about, and it is the reason it has not aged. The gold standard's entire promise was that it put money beyond politics. No politician could inflate away your savings, no committee could decide who was worth rescuing. The rule decided, and the rule was blind. But October 1931 shows what that blindness actually delivered. Not the absence of a political choice, the most political choice imaginable. Somebody's interests were protected that month, decisively and at great cost, and somebody's were not. The rule did not prevent that. It only made it unnecessary for anyone to admit it, or to be held responsible for it. And notice how the promise inverts under pressure. A rule that cannot be suspended will break the country. A rule that can be suspended is a decision wearing a costume. There is no third option, and every monetary system since has had to pick one. We picked the second, and we live inside it now. The constraint is gone. When the next panic arrives, a central bank decides openly in a press conference which institutions are solvent, which markets get a backstop, and how much of the currency's value the rest of us will contribute to the rescue. That is uncomfortable, and the people who wanted a rule instead of a committee were not fools. They had watched governments debase money for centuries, and they wanted a fixed point. But it is worth knowing what the fixed point cost when it was tested. In 8 days in October 1931, an institution created to be the lender of last resort more than doubled the price of emergency cash. In the 61 days around it, 827 American banks stopped paying their depositors. The gold stayed exactly where it was. That was the objective, and it was achieved. If you made it this far, drop a gold bar in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And tell me this, was it a failure or was it a choice? I genuinely want to know where you land, and I read every one of them. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.